things are basically like, you know, there's an individual truth, and then there's a truth of your family, and there's a truth of the population that you're living in, and these things are all encoded in these doctrines, which is true, and you would expect it to be because the doctrines are carried along in the population. The problem is, what I hear you arguing, and you tell me if I have it wrong, is that we should therefore expect the encoded metaphorical truths in these religious traditions to be morally right. But there's nothing that actually says it will be morally right, because there are metaphorical truths that might in fact be reprehensible, but nonetheless effective. And so what I would argue, the overarching point here would be that you're right that the documents that contain these descriptions of things are full of things that are true in some sense that is not literal scientific truth, nor was that their purpose. What isn't true is that those things are inherently up to date. And
see, I mean, first of all, the first thing about that is that a discussion like that, and this is also what happened with Sam Harris, takes me to the very limits of my intellectual ability. And so even in discussing it, I'm going to make all sorts of mistakes because it's treacherous territory. But I would say my understanding of the great myths has that observation built into it. So one of the archetypes is that of the tyrannical father, which is the archetype, by the way, that possesses the minds of people who accuse Western society of being patriarchal. They're possessed by a singular archetype, and that's the archetype of the tyrannical father. They don't see that there's a tyrannical father and a wise king, because there is. That's you can't even point that out. But anyways, in some of our oldest stories, there's a representation of the dead past. So let me give you an example that everyone knows about. The story of Pinocchio is the story of the individualization of Pinocchio. He starts out as a puppet. He's a marionette. He's a wooden head. He's a liar. And he's pulled by forces that he does not understand. Right, okay, so, but he has a good father. That's Geppetto. And so he's got a good, and Geppetto wishes that he becomes a real individual. And so, and he knows that that's an impossible wish. He wishes on a star that his son could become an actual individual, knowing full well that that's unlikely and impossible. So Geppetto's a good king. So, but the story is also about Geppetto, because what happens is that when Geppetto loses Pinocchio, loses his son, which you could think about as the active, dynamic, attentive force of youth, then he ends up stultified in the belly of a whale, which is a symbol of chaos, at the bottom of the ocean, and then Pinocchio has to rescue him. So I would say there is an instantiation of evolutionarily accumulated wisdom in the great stories of the past, but they're still dead. And it requires the union. This is why in Christian theology, the Godhead has a tripartite structure. This is part of the reason. There's God the Father, but the Father's dead. The Father was right 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago and is still partly right, but he's dead. He can't participate in the updating of the process, so you need an active force. Now the active force is the same thing that generated those stories across time, right? So it's the same thing, except it's also alive in the present. And so your moral duty, and this is another thing that happens in Pinocchio, is to rescue your dead father from the belly of the whale. And that's partly what I'm trying to do with these biblical lectures, because your objection is correct. The reason it's correct is because even if the solution was correct, the landscape has changed. And it's changed incrementally or in a revolutionary way, we don't know. And so those old truths are at best partial and at worst blind. But that doesn't mean you can just say, like Mao did during the Cultural Revolution, well, let's just destroy the past. It's like, no, that would be like saying, well, you don't need a body anymore, because your body is the collected wisdom of the evolutionary process across 3.5 billion years.
I absolutely agree. Because the stories are not literal, it's impossible to know whether they, well, not impossible, but very difficult to know whether or not the truth that is contained metaphorically is still relevant, if it's been inverted and it's now absolutely false, or...
Okay. So Carl Jung talked about this a lot, hey? And one of the things he said was that your moral duty is to realize the archetype in the confines of your own life. And so you say, well, there's an archetype of perfection that pervades the West, and for the sake of argument, I'm going to call that Christ, the Christ image. It's something like that. That's the archetypal image. Now, we have a story about what Christ's historical life was like. Well, you can't have that life, because you would have had to be in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. That's not your life. But what you can do is take the archetype and you can manifest it within the confines of your own life. And what that does is force you to undergo the difficult process of updating the ancient wisdom. And you don't just forego it. You can't, or well, you can, but you'll pay a massive price. And part of that will be social disintegration, because the past is alive enough so that those of us who inhabit its corpse aren't clawing each other to death while we're feeding, right? That's the critical issue. Now, it's not alive enough because the bloody thing could fall apart at any moment, and we need to be awake and alert in order to keep it updated and maintained.
Well, not only that, but the greatest hazards to us in the present are only partially going to be dealt with in these texts, and that's my biggest concern, is that, if we take Dawkins dismissing religion as mind virus, this is very dangerous because it neglects the truth that you're talking about, and it prevents us from getting to a conversation in which we can talk about the fact that religions are not mind viruses. They are adaptations to past environments. They do contain a kind of truth that isn't necessarily literal and is in general not literal, but none of them, no ancient religion is up to date for Google's algorithms being the hazard to civilization that it probably is. We need to figure out how to navigate where the ancestral wisdom is simply not up to the current challenges.
Okay, so let me modify that slightly, because I think it's true and not true. The stories are erroneous in detail and right in pattern. So, for example, there's an idea that one of the things that the mythological hero does is stand up against the tyranny of the state. Now, you don't have to specify the nature of the tyranny of the state in order for that to be a truth that's applicable across different contexts. And I would say what's happened with the great religious myths is that they operate at a level of abstraction such that the abstract entities are applicable in every single environment. I'll give you an example of that. It is extremely useful to represent the phenomenology of your experience as a domain of chaos and order. That works in every single environment for every person. And so the domain of order, I can describe it technically. You're in the domain of order when your actions produce the result you desire. And you're in the domain of chaos when they don't. And then I could say, well, your task is to straddle the border between those two domains, because you don't always want to be where everything that you're doing is working, because you don't learn anything. And you don't want to be where nothing you're doing is working because it's overwhelming. You want to be stable and dynamic at the same point. And the Taoists do that very nicely, because they have a chaos order conceptualization of the phenomenological landscape. And their claim is the point of maximum proper being is right at the center of the border between chaos and order. And I think that's true across contexts. So I don't think that truth ages.
Some of them don't. But the question really is one of, at what point is there so much legacy code that taking the package is more harmful than it is benefit? And at what point if God were writing today, I'm pretty convinced that the first commandment would be, thou shalt not enrich uranium. It would make sense as the number one commandment. It's not there because uranium wasn't a concept at the point that the thing was written, nor was the hazard of enriching it obvious. And so the fact that it isn't mentioned tends to de-emphasize it as a risk. And so I guess the question is it possible, is it possible that by recognizing that these traditions carry huge amounts of ancestral wisdom forward, but that wisdom is certain to be so incomplete that it doesn't address modern questions, that we can be liberated to move forward and to honor those traditions for bringing us here, but to recognize that we actually have to move forward with something more potent and up to date, which is not easy, because you can't just take the scientific truth of the moment and implement it. A lot of it isn't even right.
It's also not that easy to rewrite a fairy tale. And some of these fairy tales that people are trying to rewrite in modern times are perhaps 15,000 years old, and people think, well, we can just update that so that the modern version will be better. It turns out that that's very, very difficult. And there's another, I'm going to play devil's advocate against my own position here, because I say, well, the religious texts encode profound and evolutionarily determined truths that are universal. Okay, which religious texts
right? They
Right,
contradict
because
each
you,
other.
well, because, and you might say, well, all of them, but then that means that obscures the important differences between the traditions, and I'm by no means certain that all of them do. You know, so I'm going to stick my neck way the hell out, because why not? It isn't obvious to me that Islam does, because it's very difficult for me to see that the totalizing nature of Islam doesn't make it unique among religions. So now, good. So, well, there's that out on the table.
If you don't mind, but isn't the issue using the word truth? Because we can say, we could use tradition and wisdom, and we're okay. But as soon as we start saying truth, then we run into problems. I mean, and even when you're talking about porcupines, where you're talking about, what would you say, metaphorical truth versus... Look, it's not true. It's real simple. Just don't go near the porcupine. Teach the kid to not go near the porcupine, because porcupine quills are dangerous. They get stuck in you. They're really dangerous. Can they throw it at you? No, they cannot. But just stay clear of them, because you don't want them to somehow or another get in touch with your body. There's no truth in that they can throw their quills at you. You benefit from being particularly aware of the dangers of their quills. But if you tell a kid that they can throw their quills, and so therefore the kid stays clear of them, he has a faulty assumption in his head. You're lying to them for their own protection.
and I
That's
wouldn't,
not good.
I wouldn't do it. The
And I
question
think the
is,
same thing can be said of everything happens for a reason. Well, here's the problem. We don't know if everything happens for a reason. Maybe when you die, you go to some auditing room, and they go, well, you know, it's all just a part of some gigantic algorithm that it's impossible for you to understand due to your limited processing power of the human brain. You're dealing with some simian sort of complex geometry that's really just designed to keep your body moving and keep you alive and spread your genetics so that you can eventually evolve to the point when you're a god.
well, first of all, I have kids. I wouldn't
Right.
tell them that a porcupine
I'm sure
throws
you wouldn't,
quills.
but why use the word truth, though?
Because, well, the question is, why do people tell you that a porcupine can throw its quills?
I don't think they do.
Oh, they do.
Well, if they do, they don't know any better.
Right.
Or they're liars.
Right, and so all I'm saying is that actually that is likely to be the product of selection. In other words, that those people who had encoded that they do throw their quills have an advantage. It's not the way I would do it, and for exactly the reason that you point out, which is if you give a child the wrong model of a porcupine, I don't know whether a porcupine is liable to be the gateway to some more important question, but if it were, you've just steered the kid wrong.
Well,
So-
it's something. Here's part of the problem, and this is and this is a really big problem. There's two things, I guess, that were brought up by what you described, and the first is the terminology of truth. Now, Harris's claim with regards to my utilization of truth was that I was absconding with the definition of truth in a false manner, but he was wrong, because the idea of truth is much older than the idea of objective truth. And the original notion of truth wasn't objective true. It was like the arrow flies straight and true, right? And it meant something like reliably on its way to the appropriate destination, something like that. And when Christ said, I am the truth and the way, well, I can't remember
The
the
light.
other. Yes. The truth he was talking about wasn't an objective truth. So Sam's idea that I had somehow, taken the idea of truth that was actually objective all along and done something crooked with it is just wrong. It's wrong.
Well, so truth can have multiple definitions.
Well, that's
so maybe there was
that's the issue, and that's exactly what we're trying to get at here. Is like there's two kinds of truth, and they may be commensurate. You may be able to stack them on top of one another, but now and then they dissociate, and this is actually what Brett was referring to as well. So, and this is where it gets so complicated that I can barely manage it. There's the truth that manifests itself in the manner in which you act. And there's the truth that manifests itself as a representation of the objective world. And sometimes both those truths are stacked on top of each other, and sometimes they're not. So like I could give you a piece of wisdom that would work well if you acted it out, that carried within it an inaccurate representation of part of the objective world. And you could say, well, maybe that's actually the case with the biblical stories, because if you read them as science, they don't read well.
So let's take malaria as a good example. Malaria. The root of the word is mal-area, bad air, right? Malaria is not transmitted by bad air. It's transmitted by mosquitoes that live in places where you might think the air is bad. So the point is, it's part of the way there.
Yeah, that's a good one. And that also gets... See, there's another weird distinction here, and that I was trying to draw with Sam, but it's a really tricky one. And we augured in because we started to talk about pragmatism, but there's also something like the truth of a description and the truth of a tool. And my sense is that people's fundamental truths are tool-like. We use them to function properly in the world. And you could say, well, a sharp axe is more true than a dull axe, and actually you can use the word true in that sense. That actually is an appropriate use of the word. There are tool truths and there are objective fact truths. Now, and in the optimal circumstance, those map onto each other. But we're not smart enough often to make them map onto each other because we just don't know enough. And there are lots of truths that we have that portray the objective world improperly that are still true.
Is the problem using the term true when sometimes you should use the term fact? Like
yes.
1 + 1 is 2, that is a fact. 1 + 1 is 2 is also true. You throw some water on a match, that is, and it'll go out. That's a fact.
Yes.
Right?
Well, as I see it, at least, there is this overarching truth, the one that Sam Harris was pointing to, the one I think you're pointing to also, and the one I imagine we all subscribe to.
Sure.
Right? There is the testable truth that reveals itself in the laboratory or in a careful experiment in the field. And that really is the top-level truth. But then there are the truths you can't speak yet. So let's take the word filth from the Old Testament. Okay? Filth means shit. Right? You're not supposed to shit in camp because God finds it offensive. Now, the problem is the germ theory of disease doesn't come about for thousands of years after that truth was written. That truth keeps you from infecting people long before you can ever explain that there are microbes that grow in human shit that are a particular danger to your population. So the point is, would you rather be held back to the place where you can actually describe the literal underpinnings of what's going on, or do you want to be liberated to say something that actually results in an improvement in health before, literally thousands of years before anybody had any idea that it was microbes at the root of this?
Yes, and you need to figure out, so an elaboration of that would be something like human beings needed to figure out how to act without dying before they could understand the nature of the world well enough to justify that.
Right, and
you'd
be crazy, now that we do have the germ theory of disease, to amplify that original crude version of the truth, or that crude approximation of what you need to believe in order to behave safely. There's no reason for that truth to be promoted. In fact, you don't hear people describing this part of the Old Testament anymore
as
because
true.
it's not relevant.
Right.
And this is probably all why dietary restrictions were in the Old Testament as well. Shellfish, red tide, eating pigs, trichinosis. There's a lot of issues that go along with that.
Yeah,
Right.
well, there is some intermingling, perhaps, of hygienic concerns with also the desire for the groups to distinguish themselves from other groups, right? Because you can unite your group quite tightly by dietary restrictions. So, back to your point about terminology, we could do something like fact and wisdom. You say truth, that's the overarching category, and then that divides into fact and wisdom. And what you want, optimally, is you want the facts and the wisdom to be one-to-one, but often they're not. And if you find wisdom where the facts aren't laid right out, you don't just get to throw away the wisdom, which is what I think happens in the case of people like Dawkins and Harris. And Harris makes another sleight of hand move, which I don't like, which is that he thinks, so let's say, except for just a second, the wisdom-fact distinction, he would say, well, the fact is the thing, and the wisdom is a second-order derivation of that. You can ground the wisdom in the fact, and I don't believe that, and I don't think that he has any real justification for that claim. And this is something I never got.
What do you mean by grounding the wisdom in the fact?
He thinks if you know the facts clearly enough, you'll know how to act.
Well, that's not necessarily true.
Well, that's a huge.
There's ways to act that are within your best interest, and then there's ways to act that are within the interest of all the people around you, but might not serve you that well.
Well, there's
and
also
that
a
distinction is where ethics come
Right,
in.
or where the consequences are delayed for some number of generations.
Sure.
Or something like that.
Yes, well, that's a big problem. And
Right.
so Sam acts as if the process of mapping facts onto action is simple if we just got the facts right. But it's the weakest part of his argument, and we never ever got to that for a variety of reasons. But part of the reason it's weak is, okay, well, there's like an infinite number of facts, man. So let's say you're standing in front of a field and you're looking at the field. The field does not tell you how to walk through it. There's a million ways through the field. And no matter how many facts about the field you aggregate, you're not going to be able to determine the appropriate path by aggregating those facts. So that's a problem that I don't think Sam is willing to take seriously. And, well,
I think there are two problems tangled up here. One of them is there's a question of is one individual supposed to have all of the facts and navigate based on that, sort of the rationality community version of things, or does, the practical truth is we can't all be experts in everything, and so we have to go along with, guides to our behavior that are approximate, and that's inherent. And then there's a question about civilization. Civilization should be guided by our best understanding of what's actually true, but with an understanding that we don't have a complete map of a lot of stuff. And so I think what you're pointing at is that there is wisdom that has been handed to us that is not such that we can just simply say, oh, here's the nugget at the center of it, and we need to preserve that thing, because we don't necessarily know what it's doing.
Yeah.
Which is, this is dangerous, because some of what it's doing may not be acceptable.
Well, and then think about, let's look at the wisdom end of things for a minute. And you alluded a little earlier to like iterations and about the fact that things are iterated across time, and that something that works now might fail dreadfully in a month or 2 months. So here's what something has to be like to be wise, let's say. Well, first of all, let's say it would be good if it was in accordance with the facts. We'll leave that aside for now. It has to work, if you operate according to the wisdom principle, whatever it is, it has to work in the world. But then it has to work in a world that allows you to maintain your relationships with people in the world, right? So it's all of a sudden this wisdom thing is something that's not only constrained by, let's call it objective reality, but it's constrained by the necessity of a social contract, a functional social contract. So you're only allowed to put forward actions in the world that would be of benefit to you if they simultaneously don't undermine the structure within which you live. Okay, and then there's a game theory element to that, which is, well, if it's wise, then it works in the world, so that'd be the constraint of objective reality. But then it works for you now, and the you that'll be in a week, and the you that'll be in a month, and it works for you and your family, and it works for you and your family and society, and it works in a way that those things all line up to be iterated across time. And so this is actually also the solution. And I'd really like to hear what you think about this. I think this is the solution to the postmodern conundrum. Because the postmodernists, bless their hearts, so we'll give the devil his due, say, well, the problem is there's an infinite number of interpretations of a finite set of facts. And the right response to that is, uh-oh, that's true. That's true. That's not good. And that's why the postmodernists say, well, you can't agree on a canonical interpretation of a great piece of literature, because the number of potential interpretations are infinite. And so then they say, well, why should we settle on any one interpretation then? Why should we privilege one over another? And then they say, well, that's all power games. And so that's you got to take that seriously. But what they missed, and this is a big deal, it's a big deal, I think, is this idea of ethical constraint. It's like, yes, there's a landscape of potentially infinite interpretations, but hardly any of them will work in the real world. And hardly any of them will work in the real world in a way that doesn't get you killed by other people or doom you because of your own stupidity to failure across time. And so the landscape of interpretation is almost infinite, but the landscape of applicable interpretation, functional interpretation, is unbelievably constrained. And I think that constraint system is what we regard as ethics. It's something like that.
Well, at some level, stories continue through time for a reason. Good stories continue for a long, the Odyssey is with us for some reason. And so there is a scientific reason, or a scientifically investigatable reason why the Odyssey has been terrible. You may not know it, but in principle, it's a question you could investigate. So I guess at the end of the day, the problem with the postmodernists is that they have a point. The point is perception gets in the way of anything we wish to do objectively, but that point only takes you so far. And
that's why they turn to Marxism, as far as I can tell, because what happens with the postmodernists is they say, oh, there's an infinite number of interpretations. And then the human part of them goes, okay, well, what am I supposed to do next then, since there's an infinite number of choices? And the postmodernist says, well, my theory can't account for that. And then they say, well, back to Marxism. And so that's why I think there's this unholy alliance between the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists. It's because postmodernism is a dead end from the perspective of applicable wisdom. It leaves you bereft and nihilistic. And that's not good, because people can't exist without a purpose. And so they sneak the Marxism through the back door and jump into this power landscape for the reasons that we discussed earlier. So
You really think that it's because of an infinite number of possibilities interpreting things? Because I've always felt that it was really just a response to capitalism. They feel that capitalism is a very negative aspect of our culture and society, and that there's got to be some sort of an alternative. Marxism is a clearly defined alternative that other people have subscribed to in the past. You could point to it. It's a structure that's already set up, and it's romanticized. And I think they adopted for that reason, because it has the socialist aspects attached to it, and they looked at socialism as it's some sort of a thing that it regards equality, and it's some sort of an egalitarian approach.
Well, okay, so we'd have to take two things apart. We'd have to take Marxism / Marxism and postmodernism apart. So we could do that historically. And I would say that although there is a reason for postmodernism, which is the reason we just discussed, that the landscape, the infinite landscape of interpretation problem, it's a real problem. If you look at it historically, postmodernism actually grew out of Marxism. And so what happened is that the Marxists laid out their theory about the human social environment being composed of a power struggle between the privileged and the underprivileged, right? The rich and the poor in its initial phases. And that's a story that's partially true, and it's got a lot of motive power. Like, the motive power is the romantic motive power that you just described. I get to be on the side of the oppressed. I get to be a warrior for what's right. There's the resentment element, which is, that son of a bitch has more than me, so let's cut him off at the knees, which manifested itself brutally in the Soviet Union. And then there's the ideological totality issue, which gives people a sense of security. That took a vicious hit by the late 1960s, because the murderousness of Marxism had been clearly laid out as a doctrine. And that opened the door to this move by mostly French intellectuals to develop the postmodern philosophy, which has these advantages which we described, but also to use that as a screening tactic for allowing Marxism to transform into identity politics. And so, like, it's hard to disentangle all the motivations that are going on in there, but there's something about it that's truly intellectually pathological, because you don't get to be a postmodernist and a Marxist. You actually technically cannot be both of those things at the same time. And the fact that most people are both of those things at the same time raises the specter of just exactly what their motivation is. And I would say it's this resentment-driven anti-capitalism. There's reasons to criticize capitalism, obviously, but it's this underground resentment-driven anti-capitalism that I think is one of the fundamental motivators.
Well, if I can add a couple things. The risk of alienating my last few friends.
In for a penny, man.
Yeah, I guess. So here's the thing. What's up with Marxism is, there's a lot in Marx's critique of capitalism that's actually right. And so that kind of gets you through the door once you start looking at the analysis. And then there's the prescription, which is toxic. But it's not obvious why it's toxic. In other words, it's a pretty good story that doesn't happen to function. And so people gravitate to it because the story is moderately compelling. It's not game theoretically functional or stable or viable, and it does descend into this kind of, inevitable grave violence. And so we know that now historically. It's not just a theoretical issue. We've now seen enough of it to know that as a fact. But nonetheless, the fact that there are people telling the story to kids who don't yet know what to do with something that sounds like it might be true, is very dangerous.
If you don't mind, break it down as to why it goes bad.
Well, I mean, it's sort of a tired critique, but I happen to think it's about right, which is that it just does not take account of what a human being is and what makes society function.
Spoken like a true fascist biological essentialist. Yeah, but no, I think that
wasn't very nice, Peterson.
I think that is. Well, I think it might be related back to. Oh, okay. So let's go back to the idea that Marx had something to say. Okay, and we could clarify that a little bit. So here's a problem. This is the problem that seems to emerge as the function of some really fundamental force that we don't quite understand. And that's this phenomena that I've been referring to as the Pareto distribution. Okay, so here's the situation. if you look at any creative endeavor that human beings engage in, so that would be an endeavor where there's variability in individual production. It doesn't matter what it is. Here's what happens. People compete to produce whatever that is, and almost everybody produces zero. They lose completely. A small minority are a tiny bit successful, and a hyper minority are insanely successful. And so the Pareto distribution, and the Pareto distribution is the geometric graph representation of that phenomenon. And so here's how it manifests itself. If you have 10,000 people, 100 of them have half the money. So the rule is the square root of the number of people under consideration have half of whatever it is that's under consideration. So this works everywhere. So if you took 100 classical composers, 10 of them produce half the music that's played. And then if you take the 10 composers and you take 1,000 of their songs, 30 of those songs, which is the square root of 1,000 roughly speaking, are played 50% of the time. And so there's this underlying natural law, which is, it's expressed as the Matthieu Principle, which is from a New Testament statement. The statement is, to those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. It's a vicious statement, but it's actually, here's one of those places where it's actually empirically true. This happens everywhere. And so what Marx observed was that capital tended to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And he said that's a flaw of the capitalist system. That's wrong. It's not a flaw of the capitalist system. It is a feature of every single system of production that we know of, no matter who set it up and how it operates. And so then now we have a problem, because what happens is, as soon as you set up a domain of production, and you need to because you need things to be produced, then you instantly produce a competition, and the spoils go disproportionately to a tiny percentage of people. So then so what? Well, so the rest of the people starve, or the system becomes unstable because everybody's mad. It's like, that's a big problem. Okay, so how do human beings fix that? Well, the first thing we did was diversify the number of productive games. So you don't get to be NBA basketball star, but you can run a podcast. It's a completely different competitive landscape, so we can fractionate the production landscape, and then people who aren't successful in one domain might be successful in others. That's human creativity. We're really good at that. But the problem with that is you still get a positive correlation among the successful people. So because you're so successful, for example, with your podcast and your YouTube videos, your connection network is insanely powerful, right? So you still have this tendency for what's useful and good to be, distributed, let's call it inequitably. And it's got the power of a physical law. In fact, there are people, they call themselves econophysicists. No one knows that there's a field, econophysicists, econophysics, and they use the same mathematical equations that represent the propagation of gas molecules into a vacuum to describe the manner in which money distributes itself in an economy. Okay, so Marx pointed to a fundamental issue, but he said, well, that's a fault with capitalism. It's like, no, it isn't. It's something way more pernicious than that. And it's something like, well, when one good thing happens to you, it makes you a little more powerful and attractive. And so that fractionally increases the possibility that another good thing will happen to you. And then that spirals out of control, and you get people who have, they have all the money, or they have all the podcast downloads. You're in that position. What is it, 1.2 billion? Like, what the hell? But it's to those who have more, and it's not because there's something oppressive about you. It's because you rode the wave of the Pareto distribution, and it threw you way the hell up into the stratosphere. And we don't know what to do about that. Like, should you be sharing your podcast views with the oppressed and downtrodden? I mean, you've got a few billion, you could spread the damn things around. It's not fair that you're the only one that's being listened to. It's the same argument. And it's a compelling argument, because why the hell should you have all that power? If you call it power, you could call it authority or competence.
But isn't that a different argument? Because no one's asking anyone to download anything specific. No one's compelling anyone to download anything specific. You could download whatever you want. And if you put more effort and more time and more focus into your work, whatever it would be, whether it's a podcast or your YouTube videos or whatever, if people enjoy it, they gravitate towards it. And then over time, it exponentially increases the amount of people that are exposed to it.
Well, this is why I think that and this is the other problem with the Marxist perspective, is that, and the postmodernists in particular, like, they conflate power, competence, and authority unfairly. Now, your point, it's sort of the point of free marketers. You're saying, well, look, all I'm doing is offering a product. I'm not compelling anyone. It's a quality product, or at least as far as the market is concerned, it is. If it turns out that everyone wants that, well, what's wrong with that? And I'm not disagreeing with that argument in the least, but the problem is it doesn't fix the problem. Like the problem with money, let's say. The problem is that if you let a monetary system run, all the money ends up in the hands of a very small number of people.
And you're saying this is also with any sort of creative endeavor.
Any creative endeavor, man.
Now, what is wrong? Like, I think the real issue would be to maximize potential output or maximize the amount of successful people. You'd have to figure out don't concentrate on what people are doing right, concentrate on what people are doing wrong. Like, what are the people doing wrong that are failing? Whether in any creative
that's partly why we put together, so just to be 1 minute over, that's partly why we put together the future authoring program, because we were trying to figure out what made people successful. And one of the things that makes people successful is they specify a target and then aim at it. Right, because if you're all over we do know in a relatively functional society like ours, we know what predicts success. IQ and conscientiousness are the biggest predictors of success. Now, there's a genetic lottery thing going on there that's kind of rough, but it does say that smart people who work hard are disproportionately likely to succeed. And then you might also say, well, you want to remove the impediments from people who have those capabilities so that they can move forward. And one of the predictors of success as well is to decide what your success is going to be and then work hard in that direction. And that actually works. So I think that is a very useful thing to do. And that's, well, like I said, that's partly why we've been working in that direction. So, but there's other problems that it still doesn't solve. Like one of them is, if you don't have any money, it's really hard to get some. Like once you have some, it's not so hard to get some more. But if you're at zero, Jesus, man, you're in the reverse situation. You're poor, you don't have anything, no one wants to talk to you, you can't get out of it because you're too poor to get out of it. You know, you're penalized by the economic system because you can't even afford to start playing the game. You're stuck at zero. You're stuck at zero. You can't get out. And the revolutionary types, you know, they go to the people who are stuck at zero and they say, hey, you're stuck at zero. Why don't you burn the whole goddamn thing to the ground?
Right.
Because maybe in the next iteration you won't be stuck at zero. And for young men, that's a hell of a call.
Right.
Because they're already, let's call them expendable biologically, and that makes them more adventurous and risk-taking. If someone says, and maybe that's why they wear the Che Guevara t-shirt, it's like, hey, I'm stuck at zero. Well, I'd rather be with the romantic who's burning the whole thing to the ground than to just, you know, to stay locked in my immobile position.
Right, but that zero is where massive amounts of creativity come from because of that struggle. Massive amounts of innovation, massive amounts of people who have visions, because you're not living off of some sort of trust fund. You know, you have real risk and real danger, and you have a real concern about your future. Whereas someone who has no concerns whatsoever, and their future is carved in stone, and they can do whatever they want and buy a new Ferrari every year, that they're not going to have nearly the amount of motivation as the poor person.
Yeah, well, that may be why family fortunes tend to only last 3 generations.
Yes.
And you know, you're saying, well, why don't you take a look at the advantages of zero? And one of the advantages there is that you're driven by brute necessity, and that can really be motivating.
Yes.
And that's, I think, why the children of first generation immigrants often do so well.
Yes.
You know, they're driven by necessity, and it's so. Yes, agreed. However, I would still say, you know, the zero issue is there are levels of absolute privation that are so intense that all the goodwill in the world won't get you out of zero.
Right. If you're living in a third world country in some very small village with no way out whatsoever, that is the zero of zero. You're in Tanzania on the river, people are getting eaten by crocodiles in your village, you're fucked.
Yeah,
Yes.
Zero is like a magnet.
Yeah.
It just holds you
Yeah, it's a
there.
black hole.
Having a little, very little, maybe that motivational state that's
Yes.
actually generative.
Right, there's a difference. And then what's really bizarre is those people in that village might be happier than the people who live in a gated community in Beverly Hills.
Well, I wanted to come back to this.
Please,
Your
yeah,
point
please.
about whether we should be concentrating on what you're doing right versus what you're doing wrong. Both of those will work, and we should actually be doing both of these other things maximize faster. But the real problem is that the system in which we concentrate on what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, and supposedly you get paid for some integration of those things is that we don't understand what we are wired to produce evolutionarily, right? We all operate based on the idea that we're pursuing some state of happiness or satisfaction, and we think we know what's going to get it for us, and maybe it's inventing something, and then you'll be happy, but it's a trap. The fact is, what we are wired to do is to discover opportunities, and then when we discover an opportunity, it benefits the population that we come from, and we turn that discovery into either more mouths to feed or more consumption, and we restore the state of privation, right? We restore the state in which people don't have enough. And so if you really wanted to fix this problem, if you wanted to address the problems that communism thinks it's solving but fails to, you have to engineer around this feature of human beings, where we pursue new opportunities, and as soon as we find a new opportunity, instead of figuring out a way to stabilize the benefits so that it results in a stable sense of satisfaction, for example, we fall all over ourselves to turn it into more of the same, because of course that's how we got here.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by that?
Sure. So let's look at something like let's imagine an ancient farmer. An ancient farmer has a piece of land, and that piece of land will support a certain number of people with the level of technology that the farmer is utilizing. Somehow the farmer ends up either thinking of or discovering, by watching somebody else, a wheel. Now that farmer has a technology that allows him, or however many people are working that farm, to produce that much more food with no more labor, because the wheel allows you to transport more, for example, at one time. So now that same piece of land can support more people because it can be more efficiently farmed. That could be stabilized as a kind of success. In other words, that you could turn the extra, the surplus, into a kind of persistent
luxury.
Yeah, a luxury, but I mean, luxury is a little bit too trivial sounding. You could turn it into a space where you use that to investigate important stuff. Or you could turn it into more mouths to feed, in which case, as soon as you've produced those extra mouths that are now consuming the output of that farm, now the level of fear, starvation is right back where it was. And so
that's more money, more problems.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, well, it used to be that we produced more people. Now we produce a greater quest for consumption.
Right.
But if we were smart, what we would do is we would think about the problem of how to take the gains that come from not being bumped up at the limits of a system and turn them into what we value, right?
Well, we've done some of that. I mean, we've done some of that because as, what do they say, a rising tide lifts all ships, and there's certainly some truth in that. The overall standard of living has gone up so stupendously since 1895 that it's an absolute miracle. So we've done some of that. So there's another issue, back to Marx, let's say. There's another issue that we can't contend with. And one of those might be, well, imagine that in order for society to progress, you have to allow the individual to compete in a relatively untrammeled space so that they can innovate. And then imagine that one of the consequences of that innovation is that you get these freedo distributions developing, because the innovator, or the one who's second in line to the innovator, whatever, ends up with the bulk of the spoils. So you might say there's a cost to be paid in inequality for innovation. And then you could also say, well, too much inequality destabilizes things, which seems to be quite clear. So there's room for an intelligent conversation about that, right? Because the lefties say, too much inequality. And they need to be listened to, because the evidence is quite clear. If you let the inequality ramp up enough, the whole system destabilizes, because the people at the bottom think, fuck it, we'll just flip the system upside down.
Right.
No one wants that. Like, right-wing conservatives don't want that. So, because you could make a Republican argument and say, don't let the inequality in your neighborhood get out of hand, because the crime rate will skyrocket. And the empirical evidence on that is overwhelmingly strong. Inequality drives crime. Now, you can argue about why, but the fact that it does, that's not disputable. So we could have an intelligent discussion between the left and the right, and the discussion would go something like this. You need innovation, you pay for innovation with inequality. But you need to bind inequality, because if it's too intense, then things destabilize. It's like, okay, we could agree on that. We've got the parameters set. Now we have to start thinking very carefully through how to do the redistribution issue, and we don't know how to do that. So you might say, well, we have a guaranteed annual income for people, which I think is a horrible solution, by the way, but it addresses the right problem. The problem is that we're hyperproductive, but the spoils go to those at the top. And some of those resources need to be funneled down to the people who have zero, so that they have an opportunity to at least get to the point where they can innovate, and so the whole bloody thing doesn't wobble and fall. And and I would say in some sense that's what the political discussion is about. But we've skittered off into these radical oversimplifications, which is something like, well, if you have more than another person, you're an oppressor and you're evil. And if you have less, it's because you're virtuous and victimized. And that's just a non-starter.
So you think that there's a real problem with like something like a universal basic income? You think it's a horrible idea?
Well, I think the idea that the solution is a basic income is not a good idea, because I think the problem is deeper than that. I don't think the fundamental problem is that people don't have enough money. I think the fundamental problem is that human beings in some sense are beasts of burden, and if they're not provided with a place where they can accept social responsibility, social and individual responsibility in an honorable manner, they degenerate and die. That's the opiate crisis in the West right now. Like, men who are men don't need money. They need function. And we've got a problem. One of the problems is, for example, here's an ugly stat. I think I told you this once before. It's illegal to induct anyone into the armed forces if they have an IQ of less than 83. And the reason for that is the armed forces, despite having every reason to draw the contradictory conclusion, has decided that there isn't a single thing that you can be trained to do in the military if you have an IQ of less than 83 that isn't positively counterproductive. That's 10% of the population. And we're producing a culture that's very cognitively complex. Like, what the hell are you going to do if you can't use a computer? Like, if you can use a computer, you're at least in the game. If you can really use one, you're hyper powerful. If you're not literate enough to use a computer, you're at zero. 10% of the population. The conservatives say, well, there's a job for everyone if they just worked hard enough. It's like, no, and increasingly no. And the liberals say, well, everyone's basically the same and you can train anyone to do anything. It's like, no, you can't.
Yeah. I want to go back to the inequality point here, because if you look at this biologically, actually, I think it reveals a lot. Why are we know from careful study that people are motivated by the degree of inequality more than they are the absolute level of well-being that they have. And there's a very good, it's tragic, but a very good evolutionary reason for this, which is if you are working on some piece of land and your neighbor has the adjacent piece of land and they're doing twice as well as you, it's because they know something you don't, right? And so becoming focused on what they're doing that you're not doing is a rational thing to spend your time on, so you can figure out what it is that they know that you don't. In the modern environment, this is a catastrophe, because who are your neighbors? Well, you've got some box sitting on the wall of your living room that has a totally artificial portrait of other people who may be much wealthier than you, and it's broadcasting in as if you're looking in their window, right, in the adjacent house. And so you think, you're being triggered to think that you're doing something wrong that you might fix, when in fact the solution may not be, first of all, the person on the other side of that screen may not be for real, right. But even if they are, they're not living in the same environment as you. The technology is interfacing with our brains badly. But so we have the perception of massive inequality. Economically, we do have massive inequality. You're arguing that the solution to this involves some sort of massive redistribution.
Well, as solution. I wouldn't argue, but yeah.
But nonetheless, redistribution is wildly unpopular for various reasons. And so what we've got now is a situation, this is speculative, but what's really happening is that austerity is being used as a threat to keep people who would otherwise rebel against the inequality in line. And my fear about this is that this is exactly the conditions that are going to trigger that tribal population against population mayhem that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. That when people have the sense that the burst of growth that they were experiencing is now over, the natural response is to turn on those who are not as powerful and take their stuff. That this is a totally indefensible but nonetheless biological pattern of history. And that if we want to avoid that, we have to stop sending the signals that trigger us to imagine that we've just run to the limit of the opportunity that we had discovered, and it is now time to look and see who can't defend their position.
How are we sending these signals?
Well, by basically failing to provide enough well-being that people's perception of the inequality is reduced to a tolerable level.
That's the argument for universal basic income, right?
It's certainly a strong one, and you know.
It's also a good argument for equality of opportunity, right? Because people are actually not as resentful about the success of others as you might expect. They're resentful about it if they feel that the game is fixed. But they're also willing to consider the game long term. So lots of people will say, look, like, I'm stuck at not 0, I'm stuck at 1. But my kids might make it to 4, and that's good enough. And that's been the American dream, right? And that's a really high power antidote to inequality. It's like, well, yeah, there's some inequality. We need it to keep the generative mechanism going, but the game is fair and you can play it too, and there's some reasonable probability that either you or someone you love will be successful. So it has to be a straight game, and that's why ethics is so important to keep this landscape stable. People can't play crooked games, and the rich shouldn't be fixing the game if they want to hold on to their money. And the problem is that some of them, although not all, some of them are fixing the game, and no one's happy about that, and no wonder, you know. And I guess that was evidenced to some degree by the 2008 collapse, because it seemed, and I'm just as uninformed as the next person, so I'm capable of commenting on this. It seems from the outside that the rich disproportionately benefited from the restabilization of the economic system. And people are not happy about that, and they shouldn't be happy about that, because it indicates that there's something fundamentally rotten about the game. So you could say, well, maybe people can tolerate necessary inequality if the game isn't rigged. And so that's why everybody has to act in a manner that indicates that the game isn't rigged. And that means they can't rig it. That's really what it means. So we're also being driven into this inequality corner by, I would say, by the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists, because they say, this is the pernicious thing. They say, well, the reason that some people have more than others is because every hierarchy is based on arbitrary power, and they're all oppressors. And the reason they have the money is because they stole it from you. And there's some truth in that, because there are some criminals. But when you get to the point where you fail to distinguish the productive people from the criminals, which is exactly what happened in the 1920s in the Soviet Union, you better bloody well watch out, because when you radically make things egalitarian, you're going to wipe out all your productive people, and then you're going to starve. And so that's one of the doom end scenarios that awaits us if this idiot process of polarization continues. And what I find reprehensible about the universities, and you're tangled up right up to your neck in this, is that the universities are actively agitating to produce people who believe that all inequality is due to oppression and power. And that's just, well, first of all, it's technically wrong, but it's
why
dangerous.
is that, though? You guys both operate in that system, so what?
Well, here's the problem. As far as I know, nobody has properly studied the question of what fraction of the economy is actually crooked, rent-seeking, right? Not productive. And I fear that the answer to that question is that it's an awful large fraction of the economy, not because of some conspiracy, but because opportunity is finite, but con games aren't. And so anybody who can find a mechanism for transferring wealth from somebody else for doing nothing finds that mechanism, and that thing is ever present. Whereas discovering the next big thing that's actually productive is, you know, something that goes along in fits and starts. And so if we were, I mean, really, you've described it very well. We've got a battle between two caricatures of what's true, right? Either the market is wonderful and it's producing great stuff with very little corruption, or everything that makes people unequal is the result of corruption. Both of these things are wrong, right? Markets are marvelous engines for figuring out how to do something really well. They're brilliant at this, right? And so people who see that fall in love with it, understandably, because they're so good at it. But what they're terrible at is telling you what you should want or what you should do, right? If people tell markets, here's what we would like to accomplish, and then the markets tell us, well, how do we accomplish that best? That would be a very viable system that would not result in massive rent-seeking, resulting in everybody feeling that all of their misfortunes are the result of a rigged game, which is so massively rigged that when they check, they see, yes, that is actually to a large extent what we're suffering from. But they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and so they want to throw out markets entirely, which, you know, it would be a terrible mistake.
You asked, Joe, why this has happened in the universities, and like that, I think it's one of these runaway positive feedback processes. You know, the universities start to tilt hard to the left in the 60s, and that just went out of control. And now we're at the point where that's the dominant force. And why is probably another manifestation of one of these freedo principles. It's like, well, at some point there's enough lefties hired so that the probability that they're only going to hire people equally as left or greater starts to reach 100%. And then you iterate that across a couple of generations and you get no conservatives, which is more or less the situation, say, in the humanities and most of the social sciences. And it sort of looks like a conspiracy, but it doesn't mean that anyone is actually planning it, although there are conscious attempts also to silence conservative voices, let's say. And then that's also driven by this postmodern ethos, neo-Marxist ethos, I would say, that says that all of the right, the moral right, is on the side of the left. You know, and so it's the combination of those two things. There's more things. I often think comically that if you paid sociology professors 3 times as much, the probability that they would be anti-capitalist would decline precipitously. Like, I think a lot of it's driven because there's a lot of smart people in academia, and they're underpaid relative to their intelligence. So, and that doesn't make them happy, so they get bitter and resentful about that, and they think, well, there's these goddamn bankers who are hauling in $20 million a year, and here I am, hardly struggling, but here I am struggling comparatively, and that's the issue, is comparatively on $100,000 a year, $120,000 a year. You know, I look at that and I think, well, whatever, it doesn't matter. But there's like, my colleagues are often angry with me because I do work with the business school. You know, and I also have a business. I'm not anti-capitalist in the least. But it's just dumbfounding to me, because they'll come up to me and say, well, are you so sure that you should be working with the business school? And I think, what bloody planet are you from to posit a question like that? All businessmen are evil. It's like, really? That's the level of your sophistication?
This is really an argument that's been presented to you, that businessmen are evil?
Well, they don't come out and say that, but they certainly question my motivations, for example, in forming ties with the business school.
Like, what do they say about it?
They say exactly that. They question my ethics about forming ties with the business school. So,
but they don't give you any reasons for...
You're supposed to... the reason's supposed to be self-evident, Joe.
Oh.
You know,
well, so let's give this argument its due. I mean, I don't buy this argument, but nonetheless, let's not caricature it.
Yes, that's good.
In an absolutely free market, which is not what we have, but we have something that tends in that direction. In an absolutely free market, if you compete 2 individuals, one of whom is completely amoral, will embrace any opportunity if it makes a profit, no matter what it is, and the other individual has some limit to what they will do, well, then there's no question who wins. If we give this experiment a long enough period, the individual who will do anything will outcompete the individual with moral limits, because...
Doesn't it depend on what the game is, though? Because if people find out that you have no moral limits, then they're going to remove themselves from your market.
Unfortunately not. And
no?
Here's the... I know it seems like that, and in any given round, that's true.
Okay.
But to the extent that what you're saying is, to the extent that people police their purchasing, and they will stop using Uber if Uber is ethically compromised, for example. Well, then the point is, well, what's the game? The game is to figure out which things are being monitored and not do any of the unethical things that are being monitored, but to do all of the unethical things that aren't being monitored. And so the individual who is perceiving which things they can get away with has an advantage.
That's the psychopath advantage. Right.
Well, I don't even want to call it the psychopath advantage. right? What this is that a market will train you to do this if it is unregulated. And the best that the ethically restrained person can do is compete dead even. They have no way of getting ahead because the person that is completely free, the amoral business actor, has the ability to do anything that the constrained actor has.
Doesn't this depend entirely upon what the battlefield is?
Not really. There's sort of one exception, and that exception is people who have done something that has suddenly put them in a powerful position, right? So,
like tech people.
Right, tech people who have skyrocketed as a result of having innovated the next big thing,
right,
have not been through the markets training them to discover the landscape of what isn't being monitored that you can make a profit at.
That's one of the fascinating things about tech people in general, is that these gigantic tech corporations almost all lean left.
Well, the gigantic tech corporations lean left. That's true. On the other hand, I mean, I hate to say it, but think about how Google started, right? Don't be evil.
Right.
I think they actually meant that.
Right.
Right? And the thing is, don't be evil is what it sounds like when you haven't been trained by the market to have to do whatever you have to do to beat your competition. You've just come up with a great search engine and suddenly you're on top of the world. But over time, what happens? That entity is now exposed to competition from a bunch of other entities that increasingly will find an advantage in being freer to do ethically questionable stuff. And so what it does is it forces an entity like Google to evolve in the direction of amorality. So now, don't
Kind of
be
happened
evil.
with China and Google.
Yeah.
Because Google wanted to expand into China, and so they had to make a deal with the devil, so to speak.
Right, and
They had to accept censorship.
they will find ways to rationalize everything, because to not rationalize that which their competitors can avail themselves of would be to perish. And
One
so,
of the issues was there was all sorts of fake Google going on, just like they have fake Apple stores in China. They don't have the same sort of copyright laws that we have, and you can essentially plagiarize anything you want.
And Brett, you also said that I shouldn't make a straw man of the anti-business argument of my peers, and there's another way that I shouldn't make a straw man of it. Like, despite the fact that I'm not anti-capitalist, I don't believe that every entity is a business either. And one of the things that has happened to universities that has actually, they've pathologized in a number of dimensions, but they've also pathologized along the business dimension as the administrators have become increasingly trained or drawn from the ranks of business managers. Because a university is actually not a business. It's like a church isn't a business. There are organizations that aren't businesses that you can't just cram into the free market structure willy-nilly. And so my colleagues also object to the transformation of the university into a business entity run by profit-seeking MBAs. And they should object to that, because that's not what the institution is for. So there are reasons for them to be skeptical, say, of my association with the business school, that aren't merely a reflection of a simplistic anti-capitalist ideology.
oh, there are lots of things that have no immunity to contact with the market. Right? What has happened to the university system is that markets have pushed it in all kinds of directions that are not healthy for the mission of the academy. And this is also true, journalism isn't well done in the market either, right? Journalism done in the market ends up telling you what you want to hear, not what you need to know.
Right.
So anyway, markets are wonderful, but there's certain things they shouldn't be allowed to touch, and there are certain things that they shouldn't do, like tell us what to want, right? There's no magic principle by which a market knows what's healthy and what, you might crave
Yeah, and
but
so
shouldn't have.
well, that also then brings us back to another part of the conservative, liberal left dilemma, which is, to direct the market means to impose the heavy hand of the state and its potential pathologies on the market, but to leave it alone completely means that it wanders randomly through an indeterminate landscape. And I guess part of the issue there too is it's sort of like, well, how do we properly balance foresight and planning, which you'd think would have some role in the construction of large-scale states? It's like, well, what do we want the landscape to look like? How do we balance that with the sort of comprehensive computations that the market allows? And of course, the answer to that is we have political discussions about it all the time that are untrammeled, so that we can adjust the ratio between those two things as necessary. So again, that's a argument on the side of free speech.
Yeah, I mean, really, it couldn't be more important. The real answer is that both failures are frightening.
Right.
Right? You really don't want a state nannying you and over-regulating the market and taking the magic out of it. And you don't want the completely unregulated landscape where the market, starts probing the minds of your children and figuring out how to sell them things that they don't have any ability to resist. Right? You need to figure out what that path is, and it's not easy, but you can't do it in a landscape where you can't talk about the questions.
And this brings us to censorship, doesn't it? Because this is a real issue with the marketplace of free ideas. When you're talking about whether it's Google or YouTube or whoever might be imposing their own morality and their own ideas on what you should and should not be able to discuss and what should and should not be monetized, you're essentially imposing these limits. Look, I've read once, and it's a very good point, that freedom breeds inequality because you're free to put as much effort as you'd like into something, and you're going to get unequal results. And that if you are truly free in a free world, some people are going to do far better than others, and just based on their own input, just based on their effort, just based on the amount of focus and dedication they have. It is very unequal. I know many people that are far more dedicated than other people that I know, and they do better.
Yeah, well, that's well buttressed by the empirical literature.
Yes.
Because, well, I mentioned earlier that the two best predictors of long-term success are intelligence and conscientiousness. And what intelligence is probably something like the number of credible operations that you can manifest in a given period of time. It's something like speed. Now, it's not only that, but speed's a big part of it. So if what you're doing is working and you can do it faster, that works better. That's pretty damn straightforward. And the next thing is, well, conscientiousness. Well, conscientiousness would be something like how many of those cycles of effort are devoted to that specific task. And it turns out that if there's a relationship between the effort and task success, more effort is better. And so I can give you some indication of the power of that. So if you have good measures of conscientiousness and IQ, you can predict someone's success in a competitive landscape with a correlation of about 0.6. And what that would mean is, imagine that you tried to pick people, you just said randomly you're going to be a success in the top half of the successful people, say, and you're going to be in the bottom half. You'd have a 50% chance of making that selection correctly if you did it randomly. If you did it informed by the results of a good cognitive test and a conscientious test, you'd be right 85% of the time. So you could say with 85% accuracy, which of two people would be more likely to be in the top 50%. So it's a whopping effect, and it's actually some validation for the essential integrity of our system, because we hope, given that it's essentially an open meritocracy, that smarter, hardworking people would do better, and they do. Now, other factors apply. Corruption, for example.
Lots of factors apply. I mean, for one thing, wrapped up in IQ is a big question, which is how much of the differences in IQ that exist is democratizable. That is to say, how much of this is the result of environments that aren't enriching, or there's lead in the water, or who knows what.
Yep. Not enough vitamins.
Right. My sense, actually, my intuition based on what I know biologically, is that a huge fraction, maybe all of it, but a huge fraction of differences in IQ is actually could be generalized, and that's part of equal opportunity. It's not an equal opportunity.
See, I'm way more pessimistic about that, and that's partly because, maybe because I spent because I'm interested in the amelioration of differences, so for example, that's why I built this future authoring program. It's like, hey, if we can figure out how to make people more effective, well, let's do it. So I scoured the literature on IQ enhancement, and it's bloody dismal, man. Well, it's rough. It's very, very difficult to put together a cognitive training program. Like, some things have worked in a major way. Like, the fact that people aren't starving has moved the bottom of the IQ distribution way up over the last 100 years. That's been like a walloping success. But a lot of the things that we hoped would work, like Head Start's a good example of that. Head Start was part of the American War on Poverty, and the idea was you'd give deprived kids a leg up early before they hit school, and start training them cognitively earlier. And the hope was that you'd get a freedo thing going, where they'd be a little smarter in kindergarten, and then they do a little better in grade 1, and that would make them do even more better in grade 2. Do better in grade 2. But what happened was that the kids who went through Head Start actually did get a cognitive jump on their competitors, but all the other kids caught up by grade 6. And by grade 6, there was absolutely no effect whatsoever of the training program left. Now, Head Start did have a couple of benefits. One was fewer teenage pregnancies and fewer dropouts. But that was probably because the kids who got into Head Start were either socialized better, or that some fraction of them were removed for some time from extremely toxic environments just while they happened to be at Head Start. But it didn't produce the cognitive improvements that everyone, right and left, were equally hoping for.
Yeah, but this is in some sense, it's a very much an uncontrolled experiment, right?
Absolutely.
Because A, Head Start starts late.
Yep.
And B, it doesn't insulate you from all of the stuff that comes along with growing up in the deprived neighborhood. And so,
oh, absolutely.
Anyway,
and also,
we really don't know what the truth is of human IQ. And there are some results that suggest some things that are not hopeful. On the other hand, some of them just simply run afoul with the biological realities of intelligence.
Well, here's a good example of the lack of malleability. I mean, there's a couple of things. The first is that we may already be at a point of diminishing returns in terms of eliminating individual differences in IQ, because everyone has central heating, everyone has air conditioning, everyone has enough food, everyone has access to an infinite pool of information. So you could say even if you're in a deprived environment but you're smart, the intellectual landscape is wide open to you. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, but you can make a case for that. But the more dismal end of the biological research on IQ shows things like, if you take identical twins at birth and you put them in adopted out families, that the IQ of the adopted out twins is much closer, A, to the original biological parents than to the adoptive parents, and B, almost perfectly correlated with one another, and that correlation increases as the separated twins age. So let's say you had a twin, you were both adopted out at birth. We test your IQs at 4. They're fairly close. They're closer to your biological parents than your adoptive parents. But then we test you every year until you're 60. By the time you're 60, no matter how long you've been separated as an identical twin, your IQ score is so much like your twin's IQ score that it's as if the same person was being tested twice. And that's a really complicated one, because you think, well, as twins travel through the environment and accrue different experiences, their IQs should diverge. Like, obviously. That's not what happens. They converge.
So there are a lot of places to critique that. For one thing, there aren't very many identical twins raised apart. It's a small sample.
This is definitely true.
Those identical twins raised apart carry with them whatever effects there were from the home.
Sure, and they look the same.
And so if they were damaged by an environment that was unhealthy for their mother when she was pregnant, then they would carry that through, and it would show up as similar IQ later in life. So that one really wants to see that this is true on the positive side, not just the negative side. So anyway, I'm not saying that there's nothing to it. I'm really saying I think we don't know. It's very early in this. But what I can say, and I think a couple of the things that we've settled on in this conversation already, are that an environment in which we can say anything, that we can advance any argument and test it, doesn't mean that that argument is protected, but any argument can be advanced and then challenged, that is inherent to navigating. And the other thing that I think we would agree on is that equality of opportunity is nothing but good.
Right, a fair game with equality of opportunity.
Fair game with equality of opportunity. And I guess one thing I would add, I don't know if we would agree on this, but you were talking about the fact that, forget which thing exactly, but that a system based on merit produces inequality, because people will...
Freedom.
Yeah, that freedom produces inequality. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't mean that we are obligated to ride it all the way down, right? The fact is, we could make people safe to fail, right? So that you are encouraged to attempt to do something highly valuable. And if it doesn't work out, then the point is, you're not home.
This
Right.
would be the argument for something like universal basic income, that
Right.
your needs are taken care of, your food, your shelter, and now you're free to pursue any ideas that you might have that you would ordinarily be saddled down by your issues with food and.
Well, there
Right.
is some evidence of that actually happening
Yeah.
in Canada. Now, these are multi-variable problems, and so I'm not claiming that this is true, but it's suggested. The rate of entrepreneurial activity in Canada is actually higher than in the United States. And one reason for that appears to be the fact that if you're 25, 27, let's say, and you have a family, you can quit your job and start a startup and you don't lose your health care. Right? And so
Yeah.
now, you know, the issue of universal health care is obviously a very thorny one, and it's not like the Canadian system works perfectly, but it doesn't work too badly, and we've been able to manage it for about 50 years. You know, there's artificial scarcity in the system, and the delay times are longer than they would be if you flew to the Mayo Clinic and bought your health care. Like, I would say that at the high end, the American healthcare system is better than the Canadian healthcare system. But I would say at the middle and at the low end, the Canadian healthcare system is clearly preferable, and it's also cheaper, which is quite interesting, because you would expect, especially if you're a free market type, that, you know, I know the healthcare system in the U.S. is not precisely free market, but it is more so than it is in Canada, yet Americans pay a substantially higher proportion of their overall, devote a higher proportion of their overall GDP to personal health care than Canadians do. And the stats are similar if you look at other, you know, quasi-socialized medical
There's a
systems.
great piece on that by Adam Ruins Everything. Have you ever seen that television show? It's really interesting. He breaks down pretty much a lot of different subjects, but breaks down the American healthcare system to pretty much where it went wrong. And I just encourage anybody to watch it, because it just shows how they elevated the price of all sorts of different things to sort of make up for, you know, lack of profits. And it's a really fascinating little piece. We are already almost 3 hours into this, so we haven't talked about Hitler.
Oh my goodness. Well, we kind of have.
We kind of
We
did.
kind of have. But let me just. Do you want to lay out your argument about Hitler, and then I'll respond to it? And
I don't know if I do want to. I mean, I think I actually think that I should stop, because I'm kind of at the limits of. I'm at the point where the probability that I will say something stupid is starting to increase, and I would rather not, because just saying the things that I'm trying to say that aren't stupid is dangerous enough.
yes, this isn't the topic where you want to make that kind of error.
Yes.
Right.
So I would say maybe.
Boy, is there a more charged subject?
It's funny that it's charged, because,
Yeah.
as you point out, we're pretty much all in agreement about
Yeah.
it, right? I mean, you
I
know.
mean, you find someone who's not, and they're instantly ostracized from society.
Right.
I mean, anybody who has an argument about Genghis Khan, I mean, there's a really fascinating take on this by Dan Carlin from Hardcore History, where he's talking about the amount of time that has passed since a horrible atrocity, and that there are people that will argue that Genghis Khan, who killed 10% of the world's population, changed things so badly that it literally lowered the carbon footprint of the human race while he was alive, killed some untold number of millions of people, and was responsible for their deaths. People look to him and they find all sorts of positive things to attribute to his reign. Opening up trade with China, opening up trade routes, all these different things that people have attributed to him, and that someday someone may do the same thing about Adolf Hitler. Right now,
Well,
that is impossible.
He certainly made that job very difficult with all of the documentation, and
Yes.
especially the films. But let's just say the argument that I want to level, I want to be really careful to do this so that it can't be misinterpreted by anybody.
I'm gonna enjoy watching this.
Are you? Okay. If I'm cornered, will you
We'll bail
come
you
help?
out.
No way,
Yeah.
man. The knives are going out.
Oh no. Okay, so my argument from all those years ago in my paper that I did for Bob Trivers that I mentioned at the beginning was that Hitler was a monster, as we all know, but he was a rational monster. That the program that he deployed was not what he said, mind you. What he said was wrong in many places, especially where it gets near Darwinism. It's just all tangled and broken. But what he did was rational from the point of view of increasing the amount of resource that was dedicated to reducing members of his population. And so my point is, this is the danger that we are in if we allow ourselves to imagine that genocidal impulses are more or less gone from the world because we've all assumed, or we've all agreed that they're a bad thing. And the point is that they exist in a latent program. And at a point when you have austerity as a result of usually an opportunity that has run its course and has resulted in the population growing to fill that opportunity, and suddenly there's nowhere to go because the opportunity has all been absorbed, the tendency of people is to figure out what other population is weak. And if that population is across a border, then there's some excuse for war. And if the population is within the border, then it's a genocide. But the point is that is an ever-present danger for us.
Okay, I want to clarify one thing. I mean, because this argument was sort of phrased as we have a disagreement about Hitler. And I would like to point out that I don't actually disagree with anything that you just said. Because
Okay.
if I remain relatively silent, I don't want it to be seen that the fact that I'm disagreeing with you means, or that there is a disagreement means that it's a disagreement about any of that. I think the disagreement was something like, I said that Hitler was even more evil than we thought he was. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you're pointing out the danger of assuming that you can put Hitler in he was just a monster box and don't think about it anymore. And I would say I agree absolutely with that. I mean, I've studied Hitler a lot, and there's a bunch of things that you can't say about him. You can't say he was stupid.
Right.
You can't say he was without artistic talent. You can't say that he was a poor organizer. You can't say that he wasn't charismatic. You can't say that he did wonders for Germany's economy in the first part of his reign. And so it's very necessary if you're dealing intelligently with a true monster, that you give the devil his due.
Yeah. So I think the thing that I saw in your video was, your argument was that as he was losing, instead of putting the genocide on pause and
winning the war,
that he ratcheted up the genocide.
Yeah, I don't know if it would really be. I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that it was him that did that, although I think he had a hand in it. It does appear to me that that's what happened.
Right, and my point would simply be, and again, I couldn't possibly be less sympathetic with the individual. My point is simply that from an evolutionary point of view, if your objective is coldly to increase the number of genomes that are spelled the same way that yours are on Earth, that A, he did enslave those Jews who were most fit to work in service of the German war machine, right? That's what those camps, and not all of the camps were work camps, but Auschwitz, for example, was both a work camp and a death camp. And so there was this tendency to enslave. And
so let me ask you a question about this, because I think you have to make a pretty tenuous biological argument to say that there's evolutionary utility in increasing the number of your kinsmen, but unless they're very close. But here's a slight variation of that. You tell me what you think about this. Is it reasonable to presume that a decent survival strategy is to homogenize your environment with regards to, under some conditions, to homogenize your environment with regards to racial or ethnic differences, to decrease the probability that you and yours are going to be killed?
Oh, yeah. Again, no defense of this.
Yes.
But you are right that to
Okay.
the extent that there's another population that's distinct, that population, even if it is small and has little power now, might not be small and have little power later. And so undoubtedly that program is there too.